Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I'm a Premier Field Engineer dedicated to supporting System Center technologies. Today's discussion will be part one in a multi-part series of presentations that will discuss application deployment in Configuration Manager 2012. This is part one. This is our introductory session, and in this session, well, before we get there, conditions and terms of use here, copyright and trademark information. And here's the agenda. So we're going to spend some time introducing the concepts, then talk about components and infrastructure concepts. Typically, in sessions like these, I like to go directly to the technology and spend time talking about the technology, showing you how it works, and so on. We'll certainly do some of that. But today's discussion on the introductory side really lends itself well to spending some time in PowerPoint, talking about some concepts that are going to be pretty key to understanding future topics. So we'll do that in components, and we'll also do that in infrastructure concepts. Also, the topic of application deployment is very large in Configuration Manager. It's one of the key things that Configuration Manager is used for. So when we say application deployment, that is a very specific type of deployment scenario in Configuration Manager. It's the scenario that handles, typically moving content, things like Office or Adobe or whatever else around to devices in your environment, and deploying them. Right? Then there's other types of deployments that you might do. There's certainly operating system deployment. There's software update deployment, and so on. This is specifically starting to go down the road and understand application deployment. So before we can really have that discussion and really understand all the implications behind, we need to understand the components involved in application deployment. So on the screen, the idea is trying to present what the different components are that are involved at a given site. So at the top of the screen, we see that there's going to be a site server involved. So this will either be a primary or a secondary site server that could play a role in servicing clients for application deployment. But let's talk in terms of the site server for a minute. Site servers, the primary site server, I say primary or secondary, the primary site server is unique in that it is the only type of site server that can actually have devices directly associated. So you see at the bottom of the diagram, we have a device, and ultimately that device is going to receive its instructions from the site that owns it, okay, that owns the management of it. That's only going to be a primary site. Now, you can have multiple primary sites to disperse the load of device management, but typically you'll just have, many environments would just have one, maybe two primary sites. Secondaries also play a role, but they don't have direct client management responsibility. They just play a role in making local content available. So helping the clients not have to traverse maybe a WAN link, for example, to find content, that kind of thing. Secondaries are useful in pretty corner scenarios in Configuration Manager 2012, really in those scenarios where you have unstable or very slow bandwidth connectivity. All right, so we'll talk in terms of primary sites, because all devices that are part of the Configuration Manager infrastructure will be talking to the primary site that owns them, that contains the boundary that the device reports to. Again, more on boundaries in a minute, and will provide instructions to the device. Okay, so as an administrator, you'll be working at a primary site, or you'll be working at a central administration site to configure options for the devices in your environment, or users, frankly, but ultimately, even with the user, it rolls down to a device, right? Installing and interacting with the device. You'll be configuring that at a primary or typically a CAS, central administration site, if you have one. When you make a configuration at the primary site, ultimately that configuration has to get implemented on your device in order for your configuration to be successful. Well, there's different roles that play a part in helping that take place in Configuration Manager. All right, there is the management point, for example. IIS is required for the management point. I actually intended to put IIS/management point to call that out, but I do that on the other slide. But management point is pivotal. In fact, the management point is the only role, known as a site system role, that the client typically talks to directly. Okay, there are others, but the vast majority of all client communication goes directly to the management point. The client, the device never, and I'll use those terms interchangeably, just old habit. The device never directly addresses its primary site. Okay, it always addresses its primary server through the management point. Whenever you work at the primary server to configure anything really that a client is supposed to do, what happens is this gets converted into what's called policy on the primary server and stored in the database. Now, this is not to be confused with Active Directory policy. It's not the same. It's basically an instruction that the client needs to execute in order to fulfill whatever configuration is being implemented. Okay. Once stored in the database, that policy is available for the client to query and to return, so it knows what to do. But it is not sent anywhere. It's just stored in the database. Okay. Here's the point of that. Even mentioning that, when a client is operational, every now and then, by default, every hour, it will go and request policy, basically asking, what's changed? Is there anything new that I need to implement in the environment? Okay. The mechanism that it uses for that is the management point. So every hour, by default, you can change it. The device is going to query against the management point. Now, here's a little bit of probably too much attention to detail, right? But notice I said the phrase query against the management point. I did not say query the management point. Maybe some very slight, probably almost negligible difference in those phrases. But the reason I see them as different is because some folks have the perception that the management point is an information store that the client uses or the device uses to learn about what to do. And it purely isn't, right? The management point is a conduit. It is the access point for the client to learn about what to do. But the management point itself is just a gateway. So when the client queries against the management point actually will look up information in the database to respond to that device's request. So when the management point hears from the device that it's looking for policy updates, the management point in turn runs a query against the database to find out if there are any policy updates. If there are, then it will get a list of those and funnel that on back to the device. Okay, so understand that one point, right? Other components that are involved, and again, that is one component. The management point is involved in every kind of client interaction that can happen, really ongoing in production against the database. Vast majority. There are other roles, but that's the key one, right? So other roles that will take part in helping with application deployment. Certainly we have a distribution point. So the distribution point is the location at which clients will, or devices will be able to retrieve content. So if an application is being deployed in the environment, then devices will learn about that and ultimately go and try to install that application, right? The way they install that is via a distribution point. They have to pull down the content to be able to deploy it. Okay, let's talk about that for a minute. So notice that I indicate distribution points are bits enabled. They are. Every distribution point in Configuration Manager 2012, by definition, must be bits enabled. Okay, this is a shift from previous versions of Configuration Manager. Until now, distribution points could be either bits enabled or not bits enabled. The vast majority of usage scenarios today, even in Configuration Manager 2007 and 2003 for that matter, were to allow clients, devices, to interact with distribution points and download content via bits. Okay, that's a pretty important thing to understand. That's a very pivotal kind of activity to get, because by doing a bits download of the content to your device in order to do the execution, that means that the device is actually executing the installation locally. The only other option that was ever available was to execute the content directly from the distribution point. That's known as run from distribution point. That is still a possibility in Configuration Manager 2012, but it's only available in a very specific corner scenario. So a little bit of a preview ahead. In Configuration Manager 2012, we have application deployment. That's what we're talking about. In there, we have the new application deployment model, and we have the legacy package deployment model. Both still work. Application deployment models don't have this option called run from DP available. The classic package deployment model does. So that's there to support backwards compatibility and so on. So if you need to run from a distribution point or have legacy packages that do run from distribution point, it still works. That's the only place that we avoid the use of bits, though. Even still, the distribution point must be bits enabled, and bits offers some pretty interesting capabilities, pretty useful capabilities. So whenever a device learns that there's content that it needs, okay, it's going to either learn of that through one of two, or in one of two categories. Either the content that's coming down to be deployed is an optional kind of content, right, which is possible. You might make something available to the device population that the entire device population may not need, right? You want it to be an optional kind of installation. So we allow for that, and no problem. The other kind is where you configure and say, this application deployment is mandatory. It has to be there, right? So in that scenario, when the device learns that there is a pending deployment in the future that will be mandatory, that device at that time will immediately begin to try to download the content. Right? The ultimate execution for any content, really, unless you use run from DP, will be to execute it locally from the disk. So if we know that something mandatory is coming up, and we can preload and go ahead and pre-download that content onto the local device's hard disk, okay, then when it comes runtime, it's already there. There's no network hit as a result of maybe 1,000 clients going to get the content at any one time. Okay, and by the policy cycle, as clients learn about it, this is one of the considerations if you do decide to adjust your policy cycle. Every hour, clients' devices will naturally randomize over that hour and learn about things at a different time. So not every single device will immediately hit the distribution point and try to start downloading content. Okay? All right. So another point of clarification. So I kind of draw, you probably figured out already, but the yellow lines are talking about what kind of communication the site server has to various components. It's certainly going to talk directly to the management point and back and forth. Management point will talk to it and so on. It'll also talk to the distribution point and stage content on the distribution point. It also will talk to the application catalog. So if you target your deployment to a collection of users or user groups, then that makes the deployment eligible to be in the application catalog. So it will stage it there, or better said, it will be available whenever you query the application catalog through the back and forth discussion of the site server and the application catalog. Then we have the black line here where we have the management point talking to the distribution point. This is where I wish I had IIS/management point like I do on the next slide. This is really not so much the management point talking to the distribution point, but IIS talking to the distribution point. So here we note that every distribution point is bits enabled. When you install a bits enabled distribution point, it will actually place a component in IIS. So at that stage, any devices that are requesting content do not go directly to this folder to pull down the content. Again, unless you're using run from DP, right? If they're bits enabled and we're doing a bits download, then instead the communication will happen to IIS. And IIS will talk to the distribution point on behalf of the device. That way we have the bits throttling. Everything just works, right? Okay. Then we have the device. So the device certainly will talk with the management point, certainly will talk with IIS. It will talk with the distribution point either via IIS or directly in the run from DP scenarios, or it will also talk to the application catalog. So the user on the device really will talk to the application catalog if there's something published there that needs to be enabled. All right. So that's kind of a look and feel of the structure. This is obviously one site, and it's a very simplified view of the site. When you add more sites into the mix and more options, then the complexity gets up there, right? So let's talk about infrastructure components a bit. All right. So as we roll along, you see the complexity has ramped up a bit, right? So same diagram we had before, just put a few pieces in this. So as you're working at the site server, ultimately as the administrator, you're working to get content, the application, staged into the environment and deployed. That's called content staging. So until your content arrives and is available at a distribution point, devices are not going to be able to access it. They will be denied access. Even if they get the policy, they will be stopped short because there's no content to deploy. Right. Now this is the same, whether it be application data, Office, Adobe, whatever, operating system deployment data, or software updates, or that kind of thing, right? So in those cases, we need to get it down there to the distribution point. So in a single site scenario, primary site to single distribution point or multiple distribution points, it's a pretty easy concept. So in this example, we have a standalone, or think of it as a standalone primary site, and a either local distribution point that's on the same server as the primary site, or it could be on a completely separate server, could be 5 or 6 servers, whatever. Once the content is, you hit go on this primary site, then the content starts to move out. Okay? On the distribution point, we will stage that content, and the content, once it's there, will be usable by the client. Now, that actually goes, there's a concept here that I want to go back to. So back on this site, I didn't talk about, so let me go back. So as we're talking about this kind of infrastructure, actually I can do it on this slide. As we're talking about this kind of infrastructure, again, it's a very simplistic view, right? It is one site right now, primary site. But in a production environment, it's very likely you will have multiple sites, especially if your infrastructure has a decent number of clients, right? So in an infrastructure like that, not only will you, as an administrator, be configuring content at a site server, typically in that environment, a CAS. Once you configure that content, you need to actually get it moved out to the local distribution points, which there are none in the case of a CAS, or the distribution points at your primaries. So when you do that at the CAS, essentially you're going to need to replicate the data about the application you're deploying to the rest of the sites in the hierarchy. Now, replication and configuration manager happens through one of two mechanisms. Either through SQL replication, which handles the definitions and site control data and all of that kind of thing, or you need to actually take the content that you're provisioning and replicate it through the infrastructure to the various distribution points that need access. If it's one site and local DPs, essentially it's just a file copy. Yes, there's some throttling even to local DPs on the site server. If your site server is also a DP, there's no throttling there. It doesn't make sense, just a local disk copy. But you can do some throttling beyond that. If you are in a multiple site configuration, then throttling between those sites will be important, and then you'll have the site-to-site communication mechanism we've all known to love through the evolution of SMS, which is file-based, right? Sending from one site to another is, in terms of content, is totally file-based, so it uses the legacy infrastructure. All right, let me take a minute and show you what I mean by throttled distribution points. So I'm going to go ahead and pull in my lab, and we'll take a look real quick. All right, stand by here. Okay, so to tie together some concepts, we have under the admin node, we have our site configuration Then we have our servers and site systems. And if you look in my example environment, we have two. We have our primary site server, which has its own distribution point. Okay, and if we look at properties of that, you'll see there's nothing here to control bandwidth across, bandwidth usage as we go across, right? No tabs for that. Here I have a remote site system. And this remote site system also provides service to the primary site. It has a distribution point, and we can look at properties of it. But notice the difference now. We do have the ability to throttle content. So we have our schedule tab, rate limits tab. This is really no different. So I mentioned that the mechanism for moving content from a primary site to a remote distribution point allows throttling. Well, that mechanism actually also exists and existed ahead of this, frankly, for site-to-site communication. So whenever you configure something at the CAS, you roll it down to your child primaries, roll it down to your secondaries for that matter. There is a site-to-site communication file-based transfer that happens, and you can throttle that as well. All right. So if you look under hierarchy configuration, you'll see addresses. And if you look at the addresses list, just pick one, look at properties, you'll see those same schedule and rate limit tabs. They're the same. All right. Okay, so let's go back to our PowerPoint for a minute and talk about it. Cool. So pull this off to the side and we'll continue. Okay, so as you stage content from your site server to your distribution point, you have to have a location that you're going to get that content from. That in Configuration Manager terms is known as a source directory. Okay? Source directories are not depicted on the slide here, but think of it as just a file share somewhere that you're storing content on. Could be the site server, though most folks, a lot of folks put it on another server altogether, right? And so that will be the location. If you're going to, for example, distribute Office, distribute Adobe, distribute whatever, you will copy those files to a location like that, known as a source folder. And then when you're building your application, point to that location, and we will pull in that content, and we'll know that if we go to distribute it, we need to go get it from that source folder and deploy it ultimately to our distribution points. If you need to make a tweak to the content, add a file, edit a file, whatever, you do that on the source file that is out here and redeploy it to your distribution point. It has been known to happen that folks, without knowing what they were really, the implications of what they were doing, would go and change things directly on the distribution point. That's one of the things that's definitely different in 2012 is you cannot do that directly on a distribution point. You have to, you can't change things manually on a distribution point unless it's legacy kind. So let's just spend a couple of minutes talking about the types of distribution points in 2012. So let me pull my lab back in. And if I go into my file share, oops, sorry, let me do it this way. Administrators that are familiar with Configuration Manager from previous versions will immediately recognize what the distribution point folder is because it's right here. This is your legacy style distribution point. You typically will not see you will never see content in this folder unless you've flagged it to be run from DP for the classic package. Right? I do have something in here just for demo purposes. But now the distribution point structure is here. So if we go into the legacy structure, you'll see here's the ID of the package. We can look at it. We could actually go in and manipulate the content here. That's a bad thing, right? Because if you change the content, there are some checking mechanisms that are in place, only exposed now in Config Manager 2012, where you can actually leverage those yourself. But to ensure that the content that you deploy is still the same content out on the distribution points. There have been scenarios, antivirus can cause it in some cases. Also, administrators getting here and making manual manipulations will cause it, where the content gets altered. And then the content basically isn't deployable at all to the clients because it's different than what was initially sent. So for that reason, we don't want to be working at this level at all. You want to make your modifications to the source folder and redeploy it. Well, the new structure of the distribution point doesn't allow for that at all. So here in our content library, you'll see that you'll have the same package ID, right? That you just saw. Actually, it's not here, but you get the same idea. Okay. But then if you start to look at this, you notice immediately that this is just some configuration information to be used elsewhere. So what you can't just go in here and modify the content on a deployment. You could, I suppose, but you wouldn't be modifying anything useful, right? This is a very specific structure of the distribution point to support things like single instance storage, all right, and hopefully to keep things structured in a better way so that we don't have corruption and so on. So let me show you what I mean by single instance storage. Pretty self-explanatory, but let's just do it again. So with the legacy distribution point, say that I had 10 versions of this package, and I wanted to make each one of them available. Each one of them had to have maybe a configuration file and all the content. Well, if I were to put that on my distribution point, it would store it 10 times. So 10 times the amount of hard drive space necessary to store the content. Whereas if I store it in my single instance store, which is here, I would store every file one time and all the unique files one time, right? So instead of storing it 10 times, I would store it once, and then the individual files within would also be stored. So it really does cut down on the hard drive space used. Another thing about distribution points, to address that kind of consistency information that I talked about, we now have, new in 2012, the ability on a distribution point to go and validate our content. So let me show you. Okay, so going to properties, we'll pop that up here in just a sec. And you'll see there is a, did it work? Let me try it again. Oh, there it goes. It just popped up behind. Go grab it. Okay, you'll see this content validation tab. So what this will do is periodically, if you choose to use it, go out and validate the content on this distribution point. Is the content that is supposed to be there? So again, it just helps make sure things keep working correctly. If it's not there, then it can surface a problem to you, and you can go fix that. Okay. All right, so let's go back to our presentation for a minute. So other things around this. So that is the typical mechanism that you would use to deploy content to your distribution point. You would have a source directory, you would tell it where to go, and it would roll out. Well, there's another concept that is available called Prestaged Content to a distribution point. This is a scenario where maybe you have a distribution point that you just, for whatever reason, don't want to copy content. Maybe you're going to put Office out there. Maybe it's a gig package or a set of source files. And you don't have a WAN link that will tolerate that kind of traffic, whether it's going to a secondary site and throttled or not. So instead, you choose to deploy that content using this thing called Prestaged Media, or Prestaged Content. Let me go back to the lab. That again is in the administration console. And if we go to our software library and application management, applications, this up a little bit. All right, pull the list in just a second. There we go. All right, and let the ribbon adjust, hopefully. There it is. So we have this ability to do prestaged content. There it is. Couldn't find it for a minute. Create prestaged content file. So what this will do is allow you to specify what the content file is going to be. Okay, so I can just call it test. I just want to call it test. All right, move on, and it'll actually validate the content, whatever. Let me move. That's the one that I have right now. Here, I can select the distribution points that we want to actually go and use to download the content. So I don't actually have this on any distribution points right now, so I'll stop right there. Right, and then that file can be used to import and save the bandwidth. So that's another option. There's this option was also available, though, through a standalone tool in previous versions. That if you've ever heard of preload package on site, then there's some similarity there. All right. Okay, so while I'm in here and talking about content staging, here let me go back. There's also the concept that isn't really new in Configuration Manager 2012, but it has some tweaks that will make it really, really useful. And folks, I believe, will use it in pretty much their only deployment mechanism. So whenever you have an application, you're going to build that application, you're going to define what that application is supposed to do, but until you put that application on a distribution point, it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to be useful. So there's a couple of ways to put the application on a distribution point. Whenever you get ready, right, you can go up here and click Distribute Content, and what that will do is start a wizard to say, okay, we're going to go ahead and distribute our application. Okay, and where do we want it to go? So we have three options. We can either send it to a collection, which might seem odd at first. Let me tie that together for you in a minute. We can send it to a distribution point individually. So if we do that, it'll pop up a list of available distribution points that I can send to, so I can treat them one at a time. Or I can send it to a distribution point group. And this is what I believe people will use pretty much exclusively in Configuration Manager 2012 because it has so many benefits. Okay, so a distribution point group, and I will come back to the collections. Okay, a distribution point group, let me just go show them to you real quick, allows you, under administration, so here's our individual distribution points. Okay, we've already seen them. Here's our distribution point groups. So a distribution point group allows you to group distribution points together that you want to treat as if they were one. Okay, so say that you have a scenario where there's 15 distribution points out there. Okay, I can pull those distribution points into the membership list of my distribution point group, and then whenever I deploy content to my distribution point group, all 15 of those distribution points are treated as a unit. They will all receive the content. Okay? Another thing, if I choose to remove a distribution point from my distribution point group, then the content, all of the content that was targeted to that distribution point by membership and distribution point group will be removed as well. The other side of that equally works, and this is really cool. If you decide to add a distribution point to a distribution point group, then all of the content that is targeted to that distribution point group will automatically roll out to the new distribution point, which is really cool. In previous versions of Configuration Manager, there was really no automated way in the console to do that. So if you added a new distribution point, you would have to go content by content to decide which ones actually roll out to your distribution point. Now, through distribution point groups, it just works. So I showed you whenever you're deploying content that you had the ability to target a collection. Well, that seems odd at first, but it works because collections can also be defined in a distribution point group. So here is just an example with all systems, right? So anytime you're deploying content to your devices, you have to actually target a collection of devices or users that you want to receive that content. It could be that you have collections set up, or you might want to, after this, set collections up that say any deployments that happen in the South Central region will make use of this set of distribution points. Okay? So what you can do is not only build your distribution point groups to include those distribution points, but also include the South Central collection. So when you target a deployment at that collection, you don't have to deploy content. The system knows, oh, it's going to these devices? Great. These are the distribution points that are defined, so we're going to automatically roll it to those distribution points. Okay? So pretty cool stuff. Definitely new in 2012. All right. Might seem a bit odd at first, but it does offer, again, some efficiencies for the admin, not to have to take the step of deploying unless you want to. All right. So let's go back to the presentation for a minute. So boundaries. Boundaries is a very key concept in Configuration Manager. Boundaries define how exactly clients are able to find various components in the environment. So I have this little blue box kind of tied around the IIS/management point, distribution point device to try to illustrate boundaries. So boundaries in Configuration Manager 2012 really serve two purposes. And again, let me pull the lab back in to illustrate this because it makes it make a little bit more sense. So boundaries in previous versions of Configuration Manager were used for one purpose only, really, and that was site assignment. Well, that's not completely true, but that's the most evident way, in-your-face way, that boundaries were used is for client site assignment. Okay, boundaries in Configuration Manager 2012 are possibly used for client site assignment, which we'll talk about more in a minute, but they're also used for content lookup, or for, said a better way, site system lookup. So let's look at our boundary here for a minute. This is probably not the best example. In my lab, I just have a single IP address defined. You can define IP addresses, IP subnets, IPv6 information, as well as AD sites. So when you define a given boundary, by itself, it doesn't do anything. One of the options you have is to define what boundary group a given boundary is part of. Without membership in a boundary group, really the boundary is useless. It's just a placeholder. It's a catalog. Okay. So this is in my CMCLT1 boundary group. That's my test client that I'm using. So if I go to boundary groups and look at the boundary group itself, let's see what we have. So when you're defining the boundary group, the first thing you're going to do is decide what boundaries are included. So in my case, I have one, and could be 10, 15, more or less, whatever works for your scenario. So think in terms of boundaries, the layout of your network, where you want Config Manager to play, where your distribution points are, your site systems are, that kind of thing. And then you move on to the References tab. So on the References tab, we see that a boundary group can be used for two purposes. One, it can be used to assign clients to your site. Okay? Or it can be used for content location. Notice the term content location here suggests distribution points, but and that certainly is included. It's not just distribution points though. So when you decide to use a boundary group for content location, really there's no check mark here, right? Whether or not a boundary group is used for content location simply is driven by the fact of whether there's any site systems added below. Okay. When you add a site system, basically you're making a mapping to say this site system is serviceable to clients that exist or can be used. This site system can be used to service clients that are on these boundaries. Okay, in this case, one. All right. So this will include distribution points. So when you think about it this way, you can very granularly map out and say which distribution points a given client is able to use. Okay. Now, more than that, you can also include state migration points, which are for OSD. Management points will have a play in the boundary groups as well. Okay, all topics that are beyond where we are, but that's what this is for. Another thing that's cool about this is in a given boundary group, you can include distribution points that are not necessarily just at your site, right? You can have distribution points from your site plus other sites in the hierarchy, which is cool. Okay. So one last concept that I want to illustrate while I'm in the console, and then we'll talk about all of this again back on the PowerPoint probably, is for a distribution point itself. So when you build that relationship and you have a boundary and associated site systems or distribution points, essentially what you're doing is creating what's known as a protected distribution point. Another way of saying that is to say we have a group of distribution points that are defined as only accessible by a given client population that happens to be on the subnets or on the boundaries that are associated with the boundary group. So it prevents those distribution points from being used potentially by other clients. And that's really, really cool when you have a network scenario with maybe some slower WAN links, divided traffic. You want to keep traffic local in various configurations. Very useful to do that. Another setting you can implement, though, on a given distribution point. Notice this is not a setting that you would put on the distribution point group. This is a setting you would put on a specific distribution point. You could do it on one or more, whatever the case may be. But let's go into properties for my distribution point. Now, notice this option. Let's find it here. Yeah, here. Allow fallback source location for content. So it could very well be, and will be, in a given configuration manager infrastructure that managed devices will move outside of the scope of management. Maybe at a hotel room, maybe to a location within the network that is not receiving configuration manager service at the moment. So when they do move outside of the defined boundaries, then the choice needs to be made whether or not those devices should receive service or not. Okay, should be able to access a distribution point or not. So this selection allows you to define whether this distribution point is visible to devices that are in that scenario, that are outside of configured boundaries, that are needing service and are asking for locations for content. If you turn this box on, and you don't need to do it, I would recommend probably not doing it for every distribution point, then this distribution point will be accessible in those scenarios. Okay, but just because you make a distribution point accessible for fallback doesn't mean that every piece of content will be allowed to do fallback. So let me show you that real quick over on the application. So under Software Library, under Applications, we'll go into Properties of one of our applications. All right, and we'll have content. Let's see, where is it? It's in one of these. Stand by. That's right. It's on the deployment type. So let's go edit the deployment type. And on content, we'll see that in order for an application to be able to use a non-preferred distribution point, you have to set it for that feature, right? So just because you have distribution points defined that allow that doesn't mean that we're going to use that for every application. It has to be set up. All right, so let's go back to our presentation for a moment, and let's put those concepts that we just talked about on the graph. So here's what happens whenever a device receives information that says you need to go and actually deploy content. The first thing it's going to do is say, okay, I know I need to do this. So what servers are available to me to be able to access that given content? So what it will do is go up and do what's known as a content location request, a location request. So the device receives policy through the management point, says, okay, you have work to do. Device sees that, says, all right, I have work to do. I need to go find out where the content is that I'm needing to act on. So it will send up a location request to the management point. When it sends up the location request, it will say, hello, management point. I'm looking for a given piece of content. Here's who I am, and here is information about me, such as IP address, AD site, that kind of thing. The management point will then run a query against the site server and find out, are there any distribution points that are available to this device given the IP information, AD site information, content information that's being requested. If there are distribution points, so if you're in a protected kind of scenario and there are distribution points that you can reach where you are, then we'll return that list through the query back to the device, and the device will go pick a distribution point if there's more than one available. Okay. But if we are outside of our boundary configuration, then and all of our distribution points are protected, then we're not going to get anything back because we're not within a boundary group, the definitions of the boundary group and the boundaries that are needed to be able to access those distribution points. So then we look and find out, are there any fallback distribution points? First of all, is the content I'm asking for allowing fallback? Actually, this would all be done in one transaction, but just to split it out for discussion. Is the content that I'm looking for enabled for fallback? And if so, are there any distribution points that have the content that are enabled for fallback? And if so, then we'll get that back, and we'll try to access those distribution points to pull the content. If not, then again we get a null response. If we get a null response along the way, then we just simply don't run the content. Okay? All right. So that's enough about that. The third piece here that is providing support for our clients is the application catalog. So if you have, and this is not a requirement at all. This is if you choose to publish data over here. And again, let me make a distinction. Yes, you are making the data available in the application catalog. Really, the data exists in the database, and the application catalog is just accessing it. Okay? But if you configure an application to be accessible in the application catalog, which is done by making that application, deploying that application to a collection of users or user groups, if you do that, then it will show up in the application catalog if the context of the current user has rights. Okay, so that's the dotted line. So if a user's on the device and browses the application catalog, they will see anything that is available to them in their context, and they will have the ability to deploy that content. Once they select Go, then that kicks in all the mechanisms we talked about. Okay. Now, one other piece that I want to fill in the blank here real quick with. So when you deploy content to a device, there's two ways you can deploy it. Well, okay, two security contexts in which you can deploy it. There's a bunch of different other variables that we haven't even touched yet for deployment. Typically, vast majority of distributions in Configuration Manager are done in the administrative context. What that means is that when the device receives instructions to execute the content, it will do so under the context of the local system account. The local system account has administrative rights to the system, so is a fine account to be able to do that in. Again, with the bits download too, you should have that content local on your hard drive on the device before it's executed, in again the vast majority of cases, other than run from DP. So the local account makes sense. It already has local admin privileges to the box and can do whatever is needed. Okay. Also, if you're trying to deploy something after hours, whenever no user's logged on, whatever the case may be, if the user doesn't have admin privileges, then you're going to need to use administrative account or access. The other option is for local user credentials to be used, which again, if the local user doesn't have admin rights in most deployments, it's going to be problematic. If you're just running a script or something that you know works, no big deal. The reason that a lot of times the local user's account is considered is maybe there's some sort of local user registry hive that needs to be present or whatever else. There's ways to deal with those types of scenarios still under the administrative context, way down the road, you know, in kind of discussion, but there are ways to do that. The third way, which is an under the covers kind of thing, is if you're deploying content that needs access to the world beyond Configuration Manager. So let me tell you what I mean by that. All of these systems, save the remote server that you see on the screen, are core components of Configuration Manager. We are built to be able to work with our components. So it's completely seamless. The administrative context on the local device works because our IIS servers and so on are enabled for anonymous access. So we control for that. We may not have explicit rights for every single machine account in the environment, but it's an authenticated user, so it's a trusted system, so we're good to go, no problem at all, right? Well, what if you're deploying content that is on our local distribution point. Maybe it's a script or something like that. And part of what is going on with that deployment is that it's going to reach out to a remote server, some other file server on the network, to do something as a result related to the installation. Now you're moving outside of the native configuration manager world, and we can't tell you whether or not the permissions are going to be in place as needed on this remote server to work. Very likely they won't be, unless you have your computer accounts all with access, read access or whatever, to these locations on the remote server that you might need. Then the deployment will fail. Okay, so there is a provision for that called the network access account. So if we enter that kind of, we're always going to prefer to use either the local system account for administrative credentials or the local user. If the local user has rights, no big deal, right? But in those administrative deployments where we're in the local user, system context, if we don't have rights, then we need to have an account that does have rights that we can substitute for making this remote call. That's the network access account. Network access account is configured. Let me close these out. Is configured on the site itself. Okay, so if we go to the site, let the site load here for a minute. All right, and go up to configure site components. All right, and look at our software distribution component. Then we'll see that there's a tab here for network access account. This account you need for sure in the environment to actually be able to do that kind of scenario I just described. Okay, so this also is an account that's necessary in many cases. Well, it's certainly necessary if you have any kind of work group clients, non-trusted clients you're trying to support. Operating system deployment makes use of it, so more than just application deployment. Okay, the other tab that you see here, let's talk about for a minute. All right, so back on the general tab, this introduces some settings that are worth talking about for a minute. So this is where we actually configure. We keep talking about perhaps sending content site to site, right? Here are some of the default configurations for how many packages, how many sites and such that we can send to at the same time, how many retry settings and all that. So Config Manager, whenever it's sending content to multiple sites, it can handle sending to multiple sites at the same time. You can adjust these just to understand that as you increase the amount of data that's moving at the same time, it does impact in other areas. Maybe not hugely, you may not even notice it, but just bear that in mind. The default settings are decent in many environments. Sometimes in larger environments you need more. In the Config Manager 2012 world, remains to be seen how many large-scale deployments will be out there in terms of number of primaries. Certainly less I would expect than we had in 2012, or 2007. But we'll see. Anyway, these settings are here to tweak if you want to. Another thing that kind of goes hand in glove whenever we talk about these settings is to understand this concept of throttling. So I've already shown where you can configure site-to-site communication throttling. It's on the addresses. By default, there is no throttling. We just expect to be able to use as much bandwidth as we need. If you enable throttling, then all of the settings here don't mean anything, right? If we're throttling, then we're trying to tightly control the bandwidth usage, and we're going to start sending things one at a time to different sites so that we can measure the bandwidth usage, make sure that we don't exceed them. So these settings only apply in unthrottled, full access, full control of the bandwidth kind of scenarios. If you throttle, then this doesn't matter. Sometimes that trips folks up. They don't understand that, so I wanted to point that out here. Okay. So one topic to go, I believe, and we'll be done with the presentation today. Oh, yeah, I already mentioned this. So I mentioned bits SMB below. Everything we do in terms of content downloading is in terms of bits. The only exception to that is SMB. Is the run from distribution point option. In that scenario, we use SMB to pull the content and to run it across the network. Okay, so one distinction there. So the roaming scenario, we've already talked about this. Okay, a little bit. Let's define it a bit more. So we've talked about boundaries and their implication in Configuration Manager. Certainly there are scenarios where you will have systems that you manage that move around either the infrastructure or even leave the infrastructure, to that hotel room scenario we mentioned earlier. When a client moves around the infrastructure, it's said to be roaming. Okay, I think I mentioned already. If I didn't, let me mention it here. When you install a client, it will assign to a site, a primary site, depending on its boundaries. Now there are ways to force the assignment regardless of boundaries and so on, but the typical way is that at installation the client gets assigned to whatever site matches its boundaries. Once a client is assigned to a site, it will never ever leave that site in terms of which site owns management. Even if the site's deinstalled, it will still be assigned to that site if the client's left operational. It won't do anything, but point is, the site assignment doesn't change automatically. There is a mechanism, there is an ability that the client has to look up site assignment, again in installation, but it doesn't move automatically. If you need to adjust the site assignment, it has to be done either by a script, by reinstalling the client with the new site code, something external to the client to get it to switch over. Okay? Now, so that does have a play in roaming. So if we have a laptop that is assigned to primary site A, as an example, then by that assignment, it's going to learn what its management point is. That will be what's called its default management point, okay, or its assigned management point. That assigned management point will never change. Okay, we will always go to the assigned management point to get policy, to get instructions, to do that kind of thing. But if we roam, so let's say that we have an office in the United States and a laptop's there, but maybe in the course of business the user has to travel to Asia, and now we're at our office location in Asia, so we're still a managed office, right? We have local boundaries there, we have a local site defined, we have a local management point, local distribution points. The client is still assigned to the site over in the United States. It's still getting instructions from its management point in the United States. No big deal. That's typically small traffic, one-off scenario, so it just works. But now the client gets an instruction to install Office. So definitely you probably don't want that running across the WAN back to the United States. So Config Manager clients' devices have the ability to make use of local management points, local distribution points, if they have the content available, right? So we still have our assigned our default management point. Now we have also our local management point. We've learned about it because the boundary that we're in now doesn't match our site in the U.S. It matches our site in China. So we learn, or I'm sorry, in Asia, maybe China, maybe one of the other countries. We learn about those resources, and we can make use of those resources to do the install locally without hitting the WAN. If we cannot find local resources, or if you don't allow us to use those local resources for whatever reason, then we just simply either can stop the deployment and hold off, or we can try to execute it across the WAN if that's what's desired. Okay. Hotel room scenario, same kind of thing. In that case, we may not be within boundaries of a site at all, and we'll need to decide whether or not we use our local resources, even though it may be across a slow connection, to deploy that content. So that's roaming. All right, and that really kind of puts a bow around what I wanted to talk about in the session, in this session. Future sessions will again start to pull back the cover.